The morning sun broke across Scapa Flow on September 26, 1939, casting long shadows over the steel giants anchored in Britain's most secure naval base. HMS Royal Oak sat motionless in the dark waters, her massive 15-inch guns pointed toward an empty horizon. 23 days into the war, the battleship represented everything the Royal Navy believed about naval supremacy: thick armor, devastating firepower, and the unshakable conviction that capital ships ruled the seas. Captain William Benn stood on the bridge, watching his crew go through their morning routines. The Royal Oak was old, commissioned in 1916, a veteran of Jutland. Her hull bore the scars of the Great War, but she remained formidable. 824 men called her home, and most of them believed they were safer here, behind the protective islands and anti-submarine nets of Scapa Flow, than anywhere else in the world. But 450 miles away, in Wilhelmshaven, Germany, a different conversation was taking place. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Preen stood before a reconnaissance photograph spread across a wooden table. The image showed Scapa Flow from above, taken by a Luftwaffe aircraft days earlier. His finger traced the narrow channels between the islands, the Kirk Sound specifically, a gap in Britain's defenses that might, just might, be wide enough for a submarine to slip through. "It's suicide," one officer muttered. Preen didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, calculating distances, depths, current speeds. The U-47, his submarine, was one of Germany's Type VIIB boats, compact, deadly, and capable of extraordinary things in the right hands. But this? Threading through a defended channel, in enemy waters, into the heart of the British fleet? Admiral Karl Donitz entered the room. The commander of Germany's U-boat fleet didn't waste words. "Can it be done?" Preen looked up. "Yes." "Will you do it?" A pause. Every man in the room knew what this meant. If successful, it would be the most audacious submarine attack in history. If it failed, 44 men would die in the cold Scottish waters, and U-47 would become another wreck on the ocean floor. "I will." Meanwhile, at Scapa Flow, life aboard Royal Oak continued with peacetime rhythms barely disturbed by war. Young sailors wrote letters home. Officers played cards in the wardroom. The engineering crew maintained the massive boilers that could push the 29,000-ton vessel to 21 knots. Nobody questioned their safety. Scapa Flow had protected the Grand Fleet throughout the entire First World War. No enemy had ever penetrated its defenses. The Admiralty in London shared this confidence. When intelligence reports suggested Germany might attempt air or submarine attacks on the fleet anchorage, the response was measured. Additional anti-aircraft guns were positioned on the surrounding islands. Patrol boats increased their circuits. But the fundamental belief remained unchanged. Battleships were the ultimate arbiters of naval power, and Scapa Flow was impregnable. On October 7th, U-47 slipped out of Wilhelmshaven. Preen told his crew only that they had a special mission. The submarine ran on the surface whenever possible, her diesel engines pushing her northward through the North Sea. The crew was veteran, men who'd already sunk merchant ships, who understood the claustrophobic terror of depth-charge attacks, who trusted their captain completely. But even they didn't know the target until October 12th, when Preen finally gathered them in the cramped forward torpedo room and showed them the reconnaissance photograph. The silence was absolute. "Scapa Flow," Preen said simply. "We're going inside." Back at the anchorage, October 13th dawned cold and clear. HMS Royal Oak swung gently on her anchor chain, positioned in the northern part of the flow. The battleship HMS Repulse had left earlier that morning for patrol duties. Royal Oak remained, along with several other capital ships scattered across the massive natural harbor. At 1900 hours, Captain Benn finished his dinner and retired to his cabin. The ship secured for the night. Most of the crew was below decks, many already in their hammocks. The marine sentries walked their posts. The war felt very far away. At that exact moment, U-47 was approaching Kirk Sound on the surface, running silent on electric motors. Preen stood in the conning tower, watching the dark shapes of the islands materialize against the starlit sky. The tide was wrong, running out when it should have been slack. The current pushed against the submarine's bow, making her sluggish, harder to control. The blockships were visible now, old vessels deliberately sunk in the channel to prevent exactly what Preen was attempting. But the reconnaissance had been accurate. There was space, just barely, between the rusting hulks and the rocky shore. "Ahead slow," Preen ordered. U-47 nosed into the gap. The current grabbed her, swinging the stern toward the rocks. The helmsman fought the wheel, his knuckles white in the red glow of the control room lights. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The submarine scraped along the bottom, a grinding sound that echoed through the hull, making every man freeze. Then they were through. Ahead, in the darkness, lay the assembled might of the Royal Navy, unsuspecting, undefended, perfectly anchored. The pride of the fleet was about to learn a terrible lesson. The hunt inside Scapa Flow was about to begin. The interior of Scapa Flow opened before U-47 like a medieval cathedral, vast, dark, and filled with sleeping giants. Preen raised his binoculars, scanning the anchorage from the conning tower. The submarine moved at bare steerageway, electric motors humming quietly, barely making ripples on the glassy surface. "I see 2 large ships," Preen whispered to his first officer. Northern anchorage, approximately 3,000 meters. Below, in the torpedo room, Oberleutnant Engelbert Endres supervised the final preparations. 4 torpedoes sat in their tubes, their magnetic pistols armed and ready. Each Type G7E electric torpedo carried 280 kilograms of hexanite explosive, enough to crack a battleship's hull if the hit was true. The crew barely breathed. Every man understood that their survival depended on absolute silence. One alert watch officer on any British ship, one lookout noticing the low silhouette of the conning tower, and the entire anchorage would explode into action. Destroyers would race toward them. Guns would open fire. They'd never make it back through Kirk Sound alive. Aboard Royal Oak, able seaman Robert Kerr walked along the upper deck on his rounds. 2,315 hours. The night was cold, the stars brilliant overhead. He paused to light a cigarette, cupping his hands against the breeze. To starboard, across perhaps a mile of dark water, he could just make out the darker bulk of another ship, possibly HMS Pegasus, the old seaplane carrier. He didn't see the thin white wake approaching from the north. In U-47's conning tower, Preen made his final calculations. Range, 3,000 meters. Speed of target, 0, anchored. Wind, negligible. Current, accounted for. He glanced at the luminous hands of his watch. 0058 hours, October 14th. Tube 1, fire. The compressed air hissed. The first torpedo left its tube with a hollow thump that resonated through the submarine's pressure hull. 20 seconds later, Tube 2, fire. 4 torpedoes were now racing through the dark water at 40 knots, their electric motors leaving no telltale bubble trails. Preen counted in his head. At 3,000 meters, impact should occur in approximately 2.5 minutes. He raised his binoculars and waited. The first torpedo missed entirely, passing ahead of Royal Oak's bow. The second struck the bow, but on the starboard side where the battleship's anti-torpedo bulge was thickest, a water-filled compartment designed specifically to absorb torpedo impacts. The explosion sent a column of water skyward, visible even in the darkness. The blast wave rolled across Scapa Flow. On Royal Oak's bridge, the duty officer staggered as the deck shifted beneath his feet. What the hell was that? Below decks, men were thrown from their hammocks. The explosion had occurred forward, in or near the paint store. Damage control parties scrambled into action, racing forward through darkened passageways, expecting to find flooding compartments, ruptured bulkheads, chaos. But the anti-torpedo bulge had done its job. The main hull remained intact. Water was entering the ship, but slowly, contained within the protective outer compartments. Within minutes, the initial assessment was complete. Minor damage, no casualties, situation under control. Probably an internal explosion, the duty officer concluded. Paint store, perhaps a fuel vapor ignition. It was the obvious explanation. They were anchored in Scapa Flow. No enemy could possibly be inside the anchorage. The idea was absurd. On U-47, Preen watched the single explosion and cursed. One hit, possibly two, but the battleship was still floating, her lights still burning. He'd fired 4 torpedoes. He should have seen 4 massive explosions, the ship breaking apart, sinking. "Reload tubes 1 and 2, he ordered. Quickly. The torpedo crew worked frantically in the confined space, muscles straining as they manhandled the heavy weapons into position. Each reload took precious minutes, minutes during which the British might realize what was happening, might send destroyers racing across the anchorage, might catch U-47 trapped on the surface. 15 minutes passed. 16. The reload was complete. Aboard Royal Oak, confusion still reigned. Captain Ben had reached the bridge, demanding answers. Damage control reported minimal flooding, all contained. No fire. No casualties. The paint store theory seemed plausible, but something didn't sit right. "Sir," a young officer ventured, "should we wake the other ships?" "Sound general quarters." Ben hesitated. Wake the entire fleet for what appeared to be an internal accident? He'd look like a fool. Besides, the damage was clearly minor. The ship was in no danger. No. Continue damage assessment. Have engineering monitor the flooding. It was a decision that would haunt the Royal Navy for generations. In U-47's conning tower, Preen had maneuvered closer, now just 1,500 meters from the battleship's starboard side. He could see her clearly now, every detail illuminated by the anchorage lights that the British, incredibly, had not extinguished. The profile was unmistakable. Royal Oak, a Revenge-class battleship, 624 feet long, bristling with guns that could obliterate his submarine with a single salvo. If they knew he was here. Bearing steady, the first officer reported. Range 1,500. Preen made one final check through his binoculars. The perfect firing solution. Point-blank range for a submarine. No way to miss. Tube 1, fire. Tube 2, fire. Tube 3, fire. The submarine shuddered with each launch. 3 more torpedoes racing through the water, tracking straight and true toward the battleship's exposed hull. This time, Preen didn't need binoculars to see the results. The night was about to erupt in fire and chaos. The first torpedo struck Royal Oak's starboard side at 0116 hours, directly beneath the bridge. The explosion ripped through the ship's hull, penetrating the anti-torpedo bulge and smashing into the magazines where hundreds of 4-inch shells were stored. The secondary explosion was catastrophic, a white-orange fireball that lit up Scapa Flow like daylight, sending chunks of steel and equipment hundreds of feet into the air. The blast killed every man in the forward engine room instantly. 13 seconds later, the second torpedo hit amidships, directly beneath one of the 15-inch gun turrets. The massive weapon, each gun weighing 80 tons, lifted off its mountings as the deck beneath it buckled and heaved. Men below decks were thrown against bulkheads with bone-shattering force. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered, died, came back dimly. The third torpedo struck aft, rupturing fuel bunkers and flooding the steering compartments. Royal Oak heeled violently to starboard, a 10-degree list that increased even as men tried to process what was happening. Water poured into the ship through 3 massive holes in her hull, racing through passageways, flooding compartments faster than watertight doors could be closed. In the junior ratings mess, 18-year-old boy First Class Wilfred Prigmore was thrown from his hammock into ankle-deep water that was rising with terrifying speed. The lights were out. Men were screaming in the darkness. Someone pushed past him, heading for the ladder. He followed, climbing blindly, his hands slipping on the wet steel rungs. The water followed him up the ladder. On the bridge, Captain Ben grabbed the engine room telegraph, but it didn't respond. No power. He could feel the list increasing. 15 degrees now, maybe more. The ship was dying beneath him, and he'd had perhaps 90 seconds to realize it. "Abandon ship," he shouted. "All hands, abandon ship." But there was no power for the loudspeaker system. His order reached only the men on the bridge and upper decks. Below, in the darkness, hundreds of sailors had no idea what was happening or what they should do. The list reached 20 degrees. Men trying to climb ladders found themselves at impossible angles, the vertical suddenly diagonal. Those in the lower decks, where the water was already waist-deep, realized with horror that they were trapped. The watertight doors above them had been closed by men trying to save the ship. Now those same doors sealed them in their tomb. Petty Officer Albert Booth reached the upper deck and stared in disbelief at the scene around him. The mighty battleship was rolling onto her side like a dying whale. Her funnel touched the water, sending up clouds of steam. Men were sliding down the sloping deck, trying to grab onto anything, launching themselves into the icy water. "Jump clear!" someone shouted. "Get away from the ship!" Booth jumped, plunging 15 feet into water so cold it drove the breath from his lungs. He kicked hard, swimming away from the hull with desperate strokes. Behind him, he could hear the groaning of tortured steel, a sound like the earth itself breaking apart. 500 yards away, Preen watched through his binoculars as the battleship died. The list was extreme now, 40 degrees, 50. He could see men jumping from the high side, tiny figures silhouetted against the dying ship. Others clung to the railing, unable to make themselves jump, paralyzed by fear or cold or disbelief. "She's going," the first officer whispered. At 0129 hours, 13 minutes after the second spread of torpedoes struck, HMS Royal Oak capsized completely, rolling over until her keel pointed at the stars. The superstructure smashed into the seabed in just 40 feet of water. Men still trapped inside screamed as air pockets compressed, as freezing water rushed in, as the darkness became absolute. The screaming lasted less than a minute. In the water, survivors struggled against cold that numbed limbs within seconds, turned fingers blue, made every breath a knife of pain in the chest. Boy Prigmore found a piece of wooden grating and held on, watching the inverted hull of his ship settle into the mud. Oil spread across the water, coating everything, getting into eyes and mouths, making it impossible to see, nearly impossible to breathe. "Help!" voices called from the darkness. "Over here! Help me!" But those who could swim were busy saving themselves. Those who couldn't were already sinking. The destroyer HMS Daisy, anchored nearby, had finally realized what was happening. Her searchlights stabbed across the water, revealing a scene from hell. Hundreds of men in the water, oil fires burning on the surface, the capsized hull of Royal Oak like a dead island in the center of it all. Daisy's crew launched boats, throwing lines, pulling survivors aboard. But the water was so cold. 5 minutes in that temperature would kill a man. 10 minutes was certain death for most. Preen made a decision. "Dive," he ordered. "Take us down to 20 meters." U-47 slipped beneath the surface just as searchlights began sweeping the anchorage. Underwater, blind, navigating by dead reckoning and prayer, the submarine crept toward Kirk Sound. The crew was silent, listening to the sounds of propellers overhead, destroyers hunting them now, racing back and forth across the anchorage. "They're pinging," the hydrophone operator reported. "Active sonar, bearing 270. But the water in Scapa Flow was shallow and full of wrecks, terrible conditions for sonar. The pinging sounds washed over U-47 without finding her, reflected and scattered by the rocky bottom, by the temperature layers, by the very hull of Royal Oak still settling into the mud. At 0230 hours, U-47 surfaced in Kirk Sound, her conning tower breaking the dark water between the blockships. The current was stronger now, trying to push the submarine back into the anchorage. Preen ordered full power, and the diesel engines roared to life. They scraped over the barrier, metal screaming against rock, and then they were through, out into the open ocean, racing south at maximum speed. Behind them, in Scapa Flow, rescue operations continued through the night. Boats circled the capsized hull, calling for survivors. Cutting torches were brought up to slice through the steel, searching for air pockets where men might still be alive. They found 13 men trapped in an air bubble near the keel. They cut them out after hours of work. 13 men, pulled alive from the wreckage. 833 others had died. As dawn broke on October 14, 1939, the Admiralty in London received the first reports. A battleship sunk in Scapa Flow by a submarine inside what was supposed to be the most secure anchorage in the world. It was impossible. It was true. The implications of this catastrophe were only beginning to emerge. The news reached Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, at 0700 hours. He read the signal twice, his famous composure cracking for just a moment. HMS Royal Oak, sunk. 800 dead. An enemy submarine had penetrated Scapa Flow, struck at will, and escaped. "Gentlemen," he said to the assembled staff officers, his voice heavy with controlled fury, "we have just suffered the worst defeat the Royal Navy has endured since Jutland, and we suffered it while at anchor, in our own base, believing ourselves secure. The morning newspapers would make it worse." The Germans had already announced the attack. Preen and his crew were being hailed as heroes in Berlin. Propaganda Minister Goebbels played it perfectly. Germany's navy, brilliant and daring, had struck at the heart of British naval power and proven that Britain's vaunted superiority was a myth. In Scapa Flow, the reality was far grimmer than any propaganda. Rescue crews continued to work around the inverted hull of Royal Oak, listening for any sounds from inside. Occasionally, they heard tapping. Men still alive, trapped in air pockets, slowly suffocating as their oxygen ran out. The cutting torches worked around the clock, but the ship was massive, and they didn't know where the survivors were. Each cut took time, and time was what the trapped men didn't have. On October 15th, they recovered the body of Captain William Benn. He'd gone down with his ship, staying on the bridge to the end. It was the tradition, the code, what every captain understood. The ship was his responsibility, and its loss was his failure, even when that failure came from forces beyond his control. Among the survivors, guilt was overwhelming. Petty Officer Booth, who jumped clear and lived, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the screaming from below decks, saw the men who'd been too slow, too trapped, too unlucky. He'd survived, and 800 of his mates hadn't. Why him? What made him special? There were no good answers. Boy First Class Prigmore was 17 years old. He'd joined the Navy to see the world, to serve his country, to become a man. Instead, he'd watched his ship die and his friends drown in darkness and freezing water. He would live to be 91 years old, but he would never forget that night. The nightmares would continue for 70 years. The Admiralty's investigation was swift and brutal. How had U-47 penetrated the defenses? The answer was embarrassing. The blockships in Kirk Sound were improperly positioned, the defenses were inadequate, the anti-submarine nets were incomplete, and, most damningly, nobody had believed an attack was possible. Overconfidence had killed 800 men. Churchill ordered immediate changes. New blockships were positioned in every channel. Massive concrete barriers were constructed, the Churchill barriers, which still exist today, turning the eastern approaches to Scapa Flow into an impassable wall. Anti-submarine nets were extended and reinforced. Air patrols increased. The stable door was firmly locked. The horse, of course, was already gone. But the deeper implications took longer to understand. The sinking of Royal Oak wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was the beginning of the end for the battleship era. If a submarine could sink a capital ship in its own anchorage, then nowhere was safe. The 15-inch guns, the thick armor, the massive investment in these steel castles, all of it could be negated by a single torpedo from an enemy who struck from beneath the waves. 3 weeks later, Gunther Prien and the crew of U-47 were decorated with Knight's Crosses in Berlin. They'd become celebrities overnight. Prien gave interviews, appeared in newsreels, attended rallies. He was the embodiment of German military prowess, young, handsome, fearless. He never mentioned the screaming. Because he'd heard it too, through the hydrophones, as Royal Oak capsized. The sound of hundreds of men dying, transmitted through the water, picked up by his submarine's listening gear. His crew had heard it. They didn't talk about it, not in the interviews, not in the celebrations. Some things were too dark to share. U-47 would continue to operate for another 2 years, sinking 30 ships totaling 162,769 tons. But in March 1941, while attacking convoy OB-293 south of Iceland, U-47 simply vanished. No distress signal. No survivors. The convoy's escorts reported depth charging a submarine contact, but couldn't confirm a kill. Gunther Prien and all 45 crew members were lost. The hunter had become the hunted, and the sea kept its secrets. At Scapa Flow, HMS Royal Oak remains on the bottom today, her hull still inverted, designated as an official war grave. It's illegal to dive on her without permission. On the anniversary of her sinking, the Royal Navy sends a diver down to place a white ensign on the wreck, a tradition maintained for over 80 years. 833 men are still inside her, forever 18, forever 20, forever at their posts. The battleship age was dying, though few recognized it yet. It would take Pearl Harbor, 2 years later, to finally convince the world that aircraft and submarines, not guns and armor, would dominate the naval warfare of the 20th century. But the lesson was there, written in oil and blood in the cold waters of Scapa Flow. On October 14, 1939, HMS Royal Oak and her crew paid the price for a lesson the Royal Navy hadn't wanted to learn. That confidence is not the same as security, that tradition is not the same as adaptation, and that in war, the enemy always gets a vote. The survivors carried that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. Some returned to sea, serving on destroyers and cruisers, fighting through the rest of the war. Others could never face the ocean again. The nightmares were too much, the memories too raw. Boy First Class Wilfred Prigmore survived the war and lived a quiet life in England. He rarely spoke about Royal Oak, even to his family. But once a year, on October 14th, he would go silent, his mind returning to that night, to the darkness, to the cold water, to the sounds of the ship dying around him. "We thought we were invincible," he said in one of his rare interviews, decades later. "We thought nothing could touch us. We were wrong." It's a lesson every generation must learn again. That pride comes before a fall, that the unthinkable is merely the thing we haven't thought about enough, and that the sea respects no one, not admirals, not battleships, not empires. HMS Royal Oak sleeps beneath the waves, a monument to 800 men and the end of an era. The oil still seeps from her hull, rising to the surface in tiny bubbles, a reminder that some wounds never heal, some debts never fade, and some lessons are paid for in blood. The battleship age had received its first mortal wound, and the world would never be the same.